So the Afghan President Ghani and the American President Obama meeting to announce extensions. President Obama and his Afghan counterpart have just agreed to keep all remaining American forces there in Afghanistan through the end of this year, almost 10,000 troops. Now, U.S. officials had said that they plan to cut that number almost in half. The two leaders made the announcement, as you heard moments ago, after meeting at the White House. It was their first face-to-face meeting since Afghanistan's president took office. More than 2,000 U.S. troops have died in Afghanistan. We've also spent, by Pentagon estimates, some $750 billion on the war. Of course, analysts say the final cost may be much higher. But Afghanistan, frankly, is still in trouble. The new president is promising to crack down on corruption, and our president says they see good signs. He's also said the Islamic State is operating now inside Afghanistan, and the Afghan military is reportedly facing all sorts of problems, including drug abuse and desertion. Our chief White House correspondent, Ed Henry, was in for the news conference this afternoon and is live with us now. Ed, to you.
Well, Shep, that is a big development because, just a couple of months ago, General Campbell, who was mentioned here, the U.S. military leader on the ground in Afghanistan, had suggested that ISIS would not make it into Afghanistan. And here we are just a couple of months later, and you have the Afghan leader talking about it, Secretary of State John Kerry yesterday indicating ISIS is trying to recruit and basically become the new Taliban on the ground in Afghanistan. That is a big reason, as you heard the president say, that to deal with the terrorism threat, that is why he is agreeing to keep 9,800 U.S. troops through the end of this year. Now, the president insisted that does not change the fact that the U.S. combat mission has ended on the ground in Afghanistan, and it also does not end the fact that he still wants to have most U.S. troops, maybe only about 1,000 left at the end of 2016 as he leaves office. But obviously, he talked about flexibility, so that number could change yet again. And I think another important point to make as to why the president changed his mind and is leaving more U.S. troops behind, at least in the short term, is President Ghani is much different than his predecessor, President Karzai. I was struck by something President Ghani did several times. He actually thanked the American people. He talked about the American sacrifice. We didn't hear President Karzai do that. And here was President Ghani saying, I was at the Pentagon yesterday thanking young children whose fathers are over serving in Afghanistan. And by the way, he said, I want to thank the American taxpayers for that sacrifice of blood and treasure that you mentioned, Shep. That's a big deal.
So the example of what's happened in Iraq has played a part in these changes, Ed. Do you know?
Oh, a big deal. And when you talk to the president's senior advisors, they've heard the criticism again and again. They still believe that a major force, a U.S. force being left behind in Iraq would not have worked without getting an agreement with the then Prime Minister Maliki, and they fought that out before. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. pulling all U.S. troops out of Iraq, a vacuum, of course, was filled by ISIS on the ground, where we're seeing now the Iranians are in there trying to beat back ISIS, and there's a great fear in the region that Iran is expanding its influence there and in Yemen and in a lot of places throughout the Mideast. And so, look, that vacuum was filled by ISIS on the ground in Iraq. That has obviously informed the president's thinking about what to do in Afghanistan. Remember, the president just over a year ago was saying that ISIS was the JV squad. No longer. They're now not just in Iraq and Syria, but as you heard, are making their way into Afghanistan. That is a big deal, Shep.
Those who would disagree with this idea of extending the level of troops for a couple of years or however long it turns out to be would remind that there are concerns about war without end and we'd never be able to get out of there. And I guess that's something that you just can't get around at this moment.
Well, given the experience in Iraq that you so rightly point out, it's informed this president's thinking about, not just pulling out of Afghanistan altogether. However, I think in fairness to the president, as you also suggest, the president pointed out at the news conference, he is somebody who surged U.S. troops into Afghanistan because he talked in the 2008 campaign about how it was a just war, basically, that because of 9/11, the U.S. should stay on the ground and fight and try and win in Afghanistan. And so he surged troops. But as he noted, and you heard him say, some perspective here. Yes, we're leaving U.S. troops behind, but we're not leaving 100,000 U.S. troops as we had in the not-so-distant past. And so, yes, we're leaving behind, for now, 9,800 U.S. troops. And so that is much different than 100,000 or more, number one. But number two, I do think to challenge the president when he says this doesn't change the fact that the combat mission is over in Afghanistan. When you leave behind 9,800 U.S. troops, whether you call it combat or not, they're dealing now not just with ISIS, but the Taliban is still there and very strong, Shep. So you might not call it a combat mission, but U.S. troops are still in jeopardy, obviously.
Ed, hang tight, please. Want to add to the mix James Goldgeier, a former State Department official and staffer at the National Security Council. He's now the dean of the School of International Service at American University and is with us live. What do you make of today's developments, leaving 9,800 troops on the ground at the request of the new president there, with whom we seem to have a better relationship?
Well, I think President Obama is clearly trying to demonstrate that he's supporting the new president's efforts. He's hopeful that this is a president who can actually provide effective governance, who can try to root out the corruption that has been endemic previously, and that he can try to get a handle on the security situation. And this was a way that President Obama could demonstrate that support by saying, okay, I'm going to give you some time, and I'm going to leave the troops that are currently there in place. He poignantly noted that there are Americans who are going to be in Afghanistan who would otherwise be home, and I think that's important to remember. But he is trying to demonstrate his support for President Ghani.
There's no question that the tasks in Afghanistan are enormous, if not unprecedented. During the course of the war, the Taliban and others have gone in and stripped much of the land bare. It's going to be very difficult for the Afghans to go in and have any sort of economy that could be built. During that process, the #1 money-making operation in all the country became opium production, which led to the heroin trade around the world, including and but certainly not limited to the Afghan President Hamid Karzai's own family members. How in the world do you break this cycle with so few natural resources at your disposal?
Well, it is. It's going to be very difficult. It's a government that relies heavily on foreign investment loans, grants, because it can only fund about 30% of its operating budget with domestic revenue. So it relies on external donors, on the International Monetary Fund. But I think you were talking before about Iraq, which is a situation where we've been so frustrated by the unwillingness of that government to be more inclusive in the country, to reach out to Sunnis and Kurds. And this is a situation where President Obama is really banking on this new government in Afghanistan to try to do better than both its predecessor, President Karzai's government, and that government in Iraq. And he really wants to show his support while leaving himself open to continuing on his pledge to reduce the American troop presence before he leaves office.
What seemed to work in the past, from the eyes and ears of all those with whom I've spoken on the ground, was to, as far as tribal leaders go across Afghanistan, and that is to pay them. When you paid them, they didn't have to then do things that would cause harm to others. And you got a lot more cooperation out of that. Does this suggest that what we'll be doing is just sort of paying them all off for the foreseeable future?
Well, you know, that's obviously going to be something that President Ghani has to address, you know, how he ensures more inclusivity, how he brings those leaders together to combat the Taliban and other forces to try to limit the presence of ISIS in the country. But as you've just pointed out, the big challenge is going to be generating some kind of economy in the country that going forward will enable the government to fund its own operations and not rely so heavily on foreign donors.
Stay with us if you would. Ed Henry, that's been the challenge for a long time. We've worked very hard to do exactly that. And frankly, aside from just paying them constantly, it's been a miserable, miserable failure.
You're absolutely right. And you heard President Ghani, after thanking the American taxpayers, sort of laugh and say, we'd like others to step up as well. That's been difficult, getting other allies to stay in this fight after a dozen years. A broader point, just quickly to make as well, Shep, is the fact that the president was asked about Benjamin Netanyahu, what's happening in Israel. Let's remember the broader context here. The Mideast is a mess right now, all throughout there. Look what's happened in Yemen, Iran gaining influence there. The U.S. may be about to cut a nuclear deal with Iran that the president believes in the long run might be good for U.S. security. His critics, like Benjamin Netanyahu, say just the opposite, pressed about that relationship. You heard the president say, this is not a situation where you hold hands and sing kumbaya. There's a great expectation. There's some tough days ahead between the U.S. and Israel and others in that region.
So, Mr. Golgaya, there was no new ground broken today, but a reiteration of previous points that were notable and in some ways historic. That is that he didn't see a way for a two-state solution under a Netanyahu path, and the president was quite clear that his corrective, as the president called it, did not correct. Where are we?
Yeah, the president's been very clear about his displeasure and pointing out, as he did today in the press conference, that Prime Minister Netanyahu, prior to the election, made those statements about no Palestinian state. And President Obama said the world was listening, your voters were listening. That's what you said. And he's holding him to account on that. This has really made a very difficult situation worse.
Mr. Golgaya, Mr. Henry, thank you both. We'll have continuing coverage of this throughout the afternoon, what it means for our military, to whom we owe so many debts of gratitude and thanks historically and to this moment.